Earlier in the week, top members of Biden's domestic policy team met with representatives of the Poor People's Campaign to talk about the priorities for the incoming administration's first 100 days. With us now, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach, Reverend William Barber. Also with us, we have editor-at-large for the nonprofit newsroom, The 19th, and MSNBC contributor, Aaron Haynes. Reverend, let's start with you. What was discussed at that meeting? What priorities are important in your mind for the Biden team to implement their first 100 days?
Well, good morning, Joe and Mika. In addition to economists and public health officials that were there, we had 32 people in the room, most of them poor and low wealth. One young lady, black low-wage worker, lost 41 family members and friends from COVID so far. One white family, white farmers, talked about the level of suicide among white farmers even before COVID. And so we talked about the need to enact comprehensive, full, just COVID relief, long-term stimulus, sick leave, unemployment, protection from eviction, quality health care for all, regardless of pre-existing conditions, raising the minimum wage to $15 immediately, updating the poverty measure so we're getting a real understanding of what poverty and low wealth is in this country, free COVID testing, free vaccines, and access to the most vulnerable and the most impacted. We talked about a national rent freeze and mortgage moratorium without the credit penalties. We talked about increasing food programs and resources to keep rural hospitals open. We're not talking about hospitals that are closing in Appalachia and the rural South. We talked about increasing public support for public education and federal infrastructure designed to be socially and climate beneficial, but targeted at poor and low wealth communities, because we're going to have to lift from the bottom up. And we talked about comprehensive, just immigration reform, demilitarizing and ending these camps, passing right now in the midst of this voting rights and repealing bad Trump executive orders and bad Trump tax policy, and that this needed to be comprehensive, because what we've seen even this week is less than one third of what the House said was needed. And it's surely not enough, and one piece of policy is not going to bring us out of what this COVID has caused, and our government inept response to it has caused. And the fact, Joe, that poor and low wealth people, 140 million of them, were already hurting even prior to COVID. And we said that many of the things that we talked about would need to be done even if we didn't do COVID. And President Biden-elect had said to us in September to about 1 million people online, he said, ending poverty will be at the center of change, the center of my theory of change, and I want to be a part of this campaign, and it's worked.
So Reverend, how was your reaction, how was your group's reaction to the Biden team's assurances? Do you feel they are going in the right direction? Are there any areas where you're concerned that they may not push for enough?
Well, in the Poor People's Campaign, we understand that it's just that, a campaign. That's why we had, people in the room. We had even 2 former HBCU presidents. We had legal scholars. We had public health officials. So first of all, they agreed to a series of meetings, because we've been talking to them a lot since the election. And that was great, number one. Ambassador Susan Rice was tremendous, and her team there. We also said to them, we didn't want to meet with Biden and Harris right now, because they've got to get this cabinet together. They have to deal with COVID and all this. We wanted to deal with the domestic policy people. And then after the election, we want to have a White House level conference with poor and low wealth people in the room. We want economists and public health officials and moral leaders in the room. And they signaled that they were open to that. And then we said to them, we want to be allies, but we reserve the right to be critics, because too often what we have is neoliberalism or trickle-down economic, and nobody talking about poor and low wealth people openly. So this was a great first meeting. We wanted to do exactly what we did and lay out a comprehensive agenda that's not so much about positions, who holds positions, but the positions they hold and who's at the center of their vision for transformation in this country.
Certainly rising income inequality and the widening gap between the rich and the poor is not a topic that was spent a lot of time on in the Trump administration, Aaron. The last 4 years have had very little discussion of that. Certainly it seems like it is picking up now as the president-elect has made it a priority, as just outlined there. But want to get your assessment so far of the team he's put in place, but also the obstacles he faces once he comes into office. And how much of this do you think is going to come down to those two Senate runoff races in Georgia? If the Democrats are able to control the Senate, will that make a big of a difference? Or are there things that Biden can do, perhaps through executive order or just on his own, even if Mitch McConnell remains Senate Majority Leader?
Yeah, Jonathan, I think those Georgia Senate runoff races certainly come into focus when you're talking about President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris's ability to address issues like poverty that Reverend Barber certainly kept front and center in this 2020 campaign, even prior to the pandemic, but certainly the systemic inequalities that have been laid bare by this pandemic, and that people like Reverend Barber are calling for to be addressed on the other side of this pandemic as part of our new normal for people who may never get sick from coronavirus, but nevertheless are still wrestling with things that don't have a vaccine, like housing insecurity, food insecurity, the wealth gap, and President Biden, to Reverend Barber's point, did say that racial inequality was one of the four crises that he and Vice President-elect Harris will confront upon taking office, and poverty is certainly a part of that. Listen, Reverend Raphael Warnock, I know from having covered him in Georgia for years, was somebody who was also squarely focused on trying to address issues of poverty and equality in Atlanta from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so, should he be elected in this January 5th runoff as somebody who would govern with that in mind. But I'm wondering for Reverend Barber, if, who expanded the electorate with a lot of these folks who would, are in these marginalized communities that would be directly impacted. How do you see, those voters now continuing to hold this administration accountable? Is that something that you're urging them to push for as this administration takes shape?
Well, definitely. We see three mandates, and one of them is we said in the meeting on Thursday, we let the Biden administration know we had a mass Poor People's Assembly moral march on Washington digitally in June. Our public health advisors asked us not to go in the streets, but we had 2.7 million people to show up. And we're intending on doing that physically in this coming year. We have to keep the pressure on. We're reinstituting Moral Monday, but we also know the Biden administration has a mandate. 55% of poor and low-wealth people voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. We don't talk about that enough. 55%, not black, not white, of poor and low-wealth people. That was an 11% increase, and more than 6 million of poor and low-wealth people that didn't vote last time voted this time. We touched about 3 million people in our campaign in 10 states, so that's a mandate. Second of all, he has a moral mandate. I like the way Joe often talks about it. The moral mandate of the Constitution. I don't want to talk about far left and far right. I want to talk about the Constitution that says if you're going to heal the nation, have domestic tranquility, you have to establish justice and promote the general welfare. Every policy should be judged by that. And then there is this biblical mandate, this deep religious mandate that says a nation, not individual charity, but nations cannot get better unless you deal with the least of these. And this country, not just with Trump, but we've had 140 million poor and low-wealth people, 43% of this nation in poverty before COVID, 8 million since May. That's 1 million a month. You cannot keep having discussions and not talk about poverty and low wealth. And the reality is you can't fix this unless you fix it from the bottom. And what we're just seeing this week, I was thinking, Joe, Mika, what we're seeing is it's looking a lot like a Herod Christmas. You know what Trump is doing, like they're going to use the military to stop things, all of the mourning that's going on. You know your Bible, Rachel mourning and refusing to be comfortable because of all the death. The government not being willing to give to a poor couple in the third trimester of pregnancy what they need, forcing them to walk across the desert. It's looking a lot like a Herod Christmas, and that's not what we need. This country is going to have to face this issue of poverty and low wealth and what Joseph Stiglitz calls the cost of inequality. Not what is the cost to fix it, But what is the cost to leave it the same? $1 trillion lost because of child poverty, trillions of dollars lost because of the lack of living wages. We cannot continue to exist like this. And I believe Biden and Harris have a mandate. And he said it, they said it when they came before us in September. We want ending poverty to be at the center of change for this administration.
All right, Reverend William Barber, as always, thank you so much. We have a lot more to talk about. Hope you'll come back.